Okay, so last chapter of Gatsby, and then that is all the kind of official content delivered. I put this in the email as well, but the plan from this stage, I'm just going to keep sending you bits of work just on the off chance that any of you end up wanting to sit the exam when that happens. I mean, I'm hopeful that nobody will want to or need to do that exam, but I just don't want to be in a position where somebody decides they do and then they're on the back foot at that point. I just want to make sure that you've got everything. You're just hedging your bets at this stage. And what's the harm in just carrying on and getting some work done anyway? It's not like you can go out and do a great deal else. So this is the close of Gatsby. Then later in the week, I'll send you stuff around kind of criticism, wider reading, just general essay stuff like that, and we'll just kind of work through things around that. It'll be done with the first years in mind as well, with their mocks coming up in the week of the 18th of May. So just be aware that it's tailored to both of them as well. In relation to Gatsby in chapter 9, it is the closing of the novel then. So there are multiple different responses within the chapter to Gatsby's death and centered around kind of Gatsby's funeral. Now, those different responses kind of serve as an insight into the way that Steinbeck presents different aspects of the society in which Gatsby lives. So he's using those responses to reflect on that kind of contemporary America, and his kind of feelings and kind of ideas around that. Then we'll have a brief look at kind of Gatsby's list that's kind of inserted within it. And in many ways, Gatsby's list kind of a little bit presents him like Connie from Grapes of Wrath. Not quite in exactly the same way, but we'll think about how it kind of fits in with that kind of idea. I've got a couple of then miscellaneous bits that don't quite fit in with the other bits around kind of Jordan, Tom, and Daisy. And then we want to look around the end of the novel and just consider whether Fitzgerald leaves us with a kind of hopeful message about that kind of American system and the kind of future of America at this point, or whether he leaves it with a kind of bleaker message at the end. What is it that he leaves us with at the end of this novel in relation to that kind of American society that he's reflecting on? Now, before we go into that, we've got the kind of main characters within the narrative here. And what I want you to do, just quickly think back over the whole course of the narrative, decide what kind of order of sympathy you would place them in. Perhaps do two lists here, in fact. The order of sympathy you would place them in personally, so who do you sympathise with more or less than the others? Try and actually rank them in order. And then maybe do a second list where you kind of consider which Fitzgerald wants us to sympathise with more or less than anyone else. And I think this is an important little starter task, because talking around this and where Fitzgerald draws our sympathy or where you feel sympathy is going to lead you into those contextual points. Because if you're made to sympathise with a character, you are going to kind of share their kind of views potentially. You are going to be more sympathetic with their actions, with what they represent, than with others. Okay, so just as a quick start, just spend 5 minutes kind of thinking around that. Okay, so from my kind of modern perspective, I think in many ways I end up sympathising with figures like kind of Myrtle and Daisy quite a lot. because they're kind of figures who are entrapped, who are simply seeking a way out through whatever means are available to them. Having said that, Fitzgerald, whilst he creates a kind of sympathy around Daisy at certain points, he's really not very sympathetic towards Myrtle, and that's probably linked with the fact that while she is entrapped, he kind of disdains her seeking to escape from the kind of social class into which she's been born. He doesn't like that necessarily, the social climbing and aspiration that goes with it. I think you could talk about Gatsby. You can link him in various different ways. And Gatsby possibly comes kind of halfway down the list for both myself and for Fitzgerald. He creates him both as a character we sympathise with, but there's an ambiguity at certain points that means that we're reminded of his criminality, of his immorality, that kind of blurs this a little bit, and kind of moves it around. Um, Again, figures like Gatsby's father, you may well sympathise with a great deal, but he's essentially almost a side figure for Fitzgerald who's written out of the narrative. So again, his lower class origins potentially make him less interesting as a figure for Fitzgerald. The same with Wilson, who suffers a great deal, and we maybe feel for his suffering, but we don't get the sense necessarily of compassion coming through from Fitzgerald's voice. So it opens up those routes into kind of discussing it in different ways. Right. Now, the first thing that you want to do in this chapter as our kind of main analysis, there are a number of different kind of key responses to Gatsby's death that are kind of mentioned within this. Their responses in kind of relation to the funeral. So there is Wolfsheim and the wider kind of gangster fraternity that he represents. They come into it, think about how they respond to the death of Gatsby. You get the figure of Owl Eyes, who comes into it, think about how he's used, what that kind of suggests around it. You get Nick himself, and you get Gatsby's father. You get the figure of Klipspringer. You get the media, okay? You get the media and that kind of gossip culture, and you get the figure of Daisy. Now, what I want you to do, go over the chapter, pick out various bits of evidence that are going to allow you to discuss how Fitzgerald represents their response to Gatsby's death, and then think beyond that. What's he then implying about them as an individual, as the representation of a larger group? What's his purpose and message behind them, and the way in which they respond to this as an event? Okay, I'd suggest probably you can take about maybe kind of 20 minutes or so scanning back through, finding the bits of evidence that's going to allow you to discuss through in relation to this. Okay, so I'm going to start with the media kind of gossip culture, I think, because it simply comes first within the chapter. So as you look at the start of the chapter on 155, you may well have picked up on things like this kind of morbid interest in the death of Gatsby. The Fitzgerald is representing a society that has reduced a kind of human tragedy into this kind of sensationalized journalism, and the way that he kind of does this in a kind of way that diminishes this kind of aspect. He doesn't seem to like it. He critiques this kind of and presents it as somewhat destructive in nature to this kind of modern American system. So we've got the endless drill of police and photographers and newspapermen in and out of Gatsby's front door. So through this kind of a hyperbolic image, there's the sense of interest that's overdone. There's this intense interest, but it's too much. There's something kind of sickening within this. And he goes on in the following paragraph most of these reports were a nightmare, grotesque, circumstantial, eager, and untrue. Now, you've got to place this back into the context of a murder. So there's an incongruity here. This idea of them being eager and of these reports being grotesque. There's a sense of the gossip, of the sensationalizing, and through the voice of Nick, we get this kind of critique of this media culture. And we've had this elsewhere in the text. Myrtle is very often associated alongside those kind of gossip magazines, Town Tattle, and things like this. So he shows a clear kind of disdain through the narrative of this kind of media culture, and shows just how kind of reductive it is in relation to genuine kind of human emotion here. So that's the first one. Then we move on to okay, and then you get kind of Daisy's response, and remember we're kind of using the narrative voice of Nick. And initially, there's that sense. I called up Daisy half an hour. This is on page 156. Called her instinctively and without hesitation. So the implication is here is that he's got this kind of belief in her fidelity, but this is kind of all part of the wider anticlimax across the kind of end of the novel, and she's gone. But she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them, and there's no address. And it kind of continues on the following bits. We get when this is on 157, when the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought this would be Daisy at last. So within the narrative voice of Nick, there's still this expectation, this connection between Daisy and Gatsby, that's not kind of finally let down until later on, where we're into the funeral itself, and on 165, and I could only remember without resentment that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. And that's it. So whilst Nick is not necessarily hurt by this, his expectations are presented as kind of let down. Daisy's response is anticlimactic. For all the love that was supposedly there before, what Fitzgerald is doing is exposing the kind of shallow and fragile nature of this relationship that they had, that Daisy is a representation of this upper class female, is not able to kind of give that kind of, or to carry through that kind of relationship with Gatsby. She's reliant on Tom. She's made her decision. There's a kind of cruelty and a callousness to this that's, again, representative of that kind of wider culture. We'll do Klipspringer next. Okay, so with Klipspringer again, it's very much similar to Daisy in that it's about kind of Nick as our narrative voice having his expectations let down. And again, this is a representation of the changes in society, how people have become very much kind of users of each other, that there's no true kind of human connections anymore in this modern America. It's all about the kind of what people can get one from the other. So you get this kind of initial belief. I was relieved too, for this seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I remember in the earlier chapters, Klipspringer's been described as kind of the lodger. He's been living at Gatsby's house. So there's this expectation that he would want to be at the funeral. But Fitzgerald kind of has him come in, and that be kind of let down again. Um, so, dun, dun, dun. Well, the fact is, the truth of the matter is, I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something. Of course, I'll do my best to get away. So Fitzgerald is kind of representing this kind of shallow nature of society, that people are kind of simply consumers, not just in relation to that kind of product, but in relation to each other, simply kind of taking what they can one from another. And Klipspringer is symbolic of that. He's an emblem of that, essentially. I think it makes sense to kind of then move into Owl Eyes as our kind of following point, where he is deliberately presented by Fitzgerald as a kind of side character, a kind of marginal character. He's only there very briefly in chapter 3, and then he's not central to the narrative at all, and he's only there very, very, very briefly. But he does present him as one of the few people who has come to the funeral. And if you think back to chapter 3, where he's introduced, he's the man in the library who has discovered the reality of kind of Gatsby's books, and this serves as a kind of an image that shows him looking past, recognizing in Gatsby that there's potentially more than just the facade, the outer image. These books aren't simply cardboard. There's something slightly more to it than that. So he appears here. He was the man with the owl eye glasses whom I'd found marvelling over Gatsby's books in the library one night 3 months before. So there's that kind of deliberate linking back to that moment. He's there at the funeral. He's one of the few voices of sympathy, who's actively sought out the funeral. But it's because he's kind of recognised a deeper aspect to Gatsby as the implication here. So you get, as it goes slightly further through, yeah, the kind of close off to his dialogue, simply the kind of, it does seem more kind of colloquial, that poor son of a bitch, as the close off, but in a world which Fitzgerald kind of creates, where there is very few people there, there's no genuine sympathy, he does stand as the exception to this, and it's because of that potential kind of deeper recognition within this. Okay, then you get the in sort of introduction of Wolfsheim's response. Now, this is slightly different to Daisy and Klipspringer in the reasons for his distance and his kind of separation at this point are depicted not necessarily as linked in to just simply the shallowness of society, but it's about that kind of criminality that is often, alongside Gatsby, pushed under the carpet somewhat. But it's recalled here to us, and this is what, again, separates Gatsby from those kind of areas of human connection, even at the point of death. So we get, as you go to page 162, Nick, did you start him in business? I inquired. Start him, I made him. So this idea of Gatsby, or Gatsby's position, is a construction of Wolfsheim. And in the next bit, we get some of the reasoning behind that, given in more overt detail. I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away that he was a fine appearing, gentlemanly young man, and when he told me he was at Oxford, I knew I could get good use of him. So for Wolfsheim, Gatsby, in terms of this kind of criminal element, is a front essentially, just like with the kind of the pharmacies that are referenced, the blinds that's kind of referenced earlier, for the kind of speakeasies. Gatsby becomes this front to Wolfsheim. He's fine appearing where Wolfsheim is not. He's got this, tenuous as it may be, this Oxford education that Wolfsheim does not. So, and this military background as well. So Wolfsheim is the one who has created Gatsby, and yet he too is presented as separated from Gatsby because of that kind of criminal element, because of that unwillingness to be associated one to the other for fear of the kind of being linked too far together. So as we get the kind of close of Wolfsheim's section on 163, let us learn to show our friendship for a man when he's alive and not after he is dead, he suggested. After that, my own rule is to let everything alone. So through that criminality, he cannot tie himself up with that kind of death idea. Okay. So with Gatsby's father at the end here, you want to kind of remember where he's been referenced before in this kind of supposed cutting off of Gatsby from his father. So if you look back to kind of chapter 6, I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time. Even then, his parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. And as he kind of comes back in, the father figure, we realise that there hasn't quite been this separation that is supposed from before, and that it serves to kind of remind us of Gatsby's past and the way that it was his kind of origins essentially here. So what we get within it, dun, 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 dun. As you go on to page 159, you get Gatsby's father referring to Gatsby as Jimmy. You also get the kind of correction on Nick's address to him. I didn't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby. Gats is my name. So this kind of returns the connection between father and son. We get through this as well. It talks about how essentially Gatsby has sent money back to him as well. Where's that gone? Hang on a second. Yeah, on 163 on to 164. He come out to see me 2 years ago and bought me the house I live in now. Of course, we was broke off when he run off from home, but I see now there was a reason for it. So Gatsby has not created this complete separation from his parents. The response of his father being at the funeral, kind of brings that connection back in, and serves as a reminder of Gatsby's kind of humble origins and that kind of journey to the top here. But of his true identity at the same time. Then we've got Nick, and I think the best bit to pick with Nick is, hang on. A bit with Nick, I'd choose possibly not necessarily from the funeral itself, but still kind of around Gatsby's death. And it's just before the end of the novel, so on 171. On the white steps, an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. Then I wandered off down the breach and sprawled out on the sand. Now, I think this is an interesting image to kind of close with because it shows Nick seeking to kind of preserve the idealized image of Gatsby, to erase the kind of more unclean aspects of Gatsby, to kind of hide those away from the rest of the world. So he's kind of presented as this kind of, admirer of Gatsby. For all of Gatsby's faults and failures, Nick admires him, and so we as the reader tend to follow that kind of first person narrative perspective, and we too kind of admire Gatsby at the end. We don't necessarily kind of ignore all of his moral failures, but Fitzgerald wants us to kind of see Gatsby as a figure that potentially we too should aspire to as well, in terms of his kind of achievement here. So we get these various responses to Gatsby's death, and all of those kind of show us ways in which, or the messages that Fitzgerald wants to put through, what he's kind of commenting on around society and around Gatsby himself. Then you get Gatsby's list, and we'll look at this just very briefly. And Gatsby's list is on page 164. Okay, now, as I say, it's kind of like Connie in this is the supposed roadmap to success. As you look at this list, there are various kind of ironies to it. But just have a quick look at it, see what kind of messages you can draw out from this list that Gatsby's written, supposedly at this very young age, as part of it. Okay, so the list is kind of an interesting one because there's something very non-specific about it. This supposed route path to success. If you do X, Y, Z, you will be successful. So there's the kind of physical aspect to it, the dumbbell exercise, the wall scaling, the educational aspects, and these educational aspects are linked to kind of progression and technology. It's study needed inventions, study electricity, etc. And there's also this recognition within it that appearance is important. Practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it. But the kind of key thing here is that it is non-specific. Yes, there's this kind of setup of supposed directions, but exactly how that is achieved is vague and ambiguous. It's like Connie. He's going to stand off and study overnight, and suddenly he's going to become a success. Well, the reality of that is different, and Fitzgerald is showing that whilst Gatsby's got these noble intentions, this kind of supposed route path to success, a lot of what else we get in this final chapter is relations of Gatsby back into those kind of criminal elements, and the reminder that his only way to success has come through those kind of criminal endeavors. He hasn't succeeded through these kind of seemingly legitimate means that are kind of set up there in that list that he's created for us. Right, a couple of other bits very quickly. There's just a couple of bits to kind of pick out. I'm just going to go through these quickly now. You get the close off of his relationship with Jordan as a kind of completely final time. She didn't answer, angry and half in love with her, and tremendously sorry, I turned away. Now, if you're talking about women within the Great Gatsby, their kind of positioning, you can talk about the kind of casting off of Jordan. She serves simply as a kind of almost a plot device within the narrative, and she's kind of discarded at this point for a final time. Then you get, and these are more important bits, alongside with kind of Daisy and with Tom. So Nick coming to this kind of recognition. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. So Tom and Daisy as representations of this upper class world, they are destructive, and they are protected from the destruction that they cause. Fitzgerald is presenting the way in which they are kind of sheltered from this. They are able to kind of metaphorically retreat back into their money, and it's their money and this carelessness that both of them share that keeps them together. And that other people must clean up the mess after them. So it becomes a kind of critique on their social class, their attitudes, and their values here. And then we get this kind of last appearance of Tom, and this implication of something kind of circular within the narrative, that Tom is once again doing exactly what he's done at kind of earlier points. He's once again potentially pursuing a female. Then he went into the jewellery store to buy a pearl necklace or perhaps a pair of cuff buttons, ridden my provincial squeamishness forever. So within this, the kind of narrative voice of Nick gives it a level of doubt, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons, but it suggests that Nick assumes he's going to kind of go, he's buying a gift for a female, and the pattern is simply repeating that nothing has truly changed with Gatsby's death, that everything carries on as normal. The status quo has been returned to. Then we just want to be able to say something around the kind of the ending, the close of the novel. So I would be using here the last couple of pages of the novel, just so we can draw some points out around it in terms of how he ends it. I would go from on page 171 to most of the big shore places were closed down now, and there were hardly any lights, to the end. And I think you want to be able to kind of pick out the way in which he shapes a kind of sense of futility here at the end, a sense of kind of loss of something, a sense that there's a kind of squandered potential within what America could have been and what it ends up becoming, that there is still a potential for the future, that it's not wholly lost, but this is laced with a kind of sadness. And the one that's kind of cut off behind the video, just the nature of society itself. How does he present the nature of society in these closing pages? So just have a look across that kind of closing page of the narrative. Think about what you could draw out from this in terms of Fitzgerald's closing messages about the nature of this modern America. The ending of a novel is very often important in terms of, that's where the writer will have their closing message. So what is Fitzgerald's closing message at the end of this novel? Okay, so within these kind of closing images here, you get the view of kind of Nick, and as those kind of images of the modern city fade away, so you get most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of the ferry. So a lot of the kind of city lights fade away, and suddenly you get this kind of retrospective view of the founding of America, essentially, or this part of America, and everything else melts away. The inner central house began to melt away, and I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. And in this image, he sees a view of America and all of its kind of potential, its newfound glory here. So it's a fresh green breast of the new world. So that image of the kind of the greenness becomes an image of growth. That's associated with that kind of image of the breast. That's something life-giving here. It's, you get the image of the breast at the end of Grapes of Wrath, with, in a different context, but in both senses, it's a kind of life-giving image, and an image of kind of sustenance. But you get a sense that something has been lost here. There's a squandered potential to it, that these vanished trees, they've made way for Gatsby's house. And remember, Gatsby's house is this kind of colossal failure, it's described as. It's something kind of monstrous, and kind of warped. So there's a sense that all this potential is, in a sense, squandered, and this place had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face with the last time in history was something consummate to his capacity for wonder. So if it's the last time in history that we get this maybe chance to create something new, but it's failed. Everything's, it's been taken over by things like Gatsby's house. So there's a symbolism at the end here of something broken, that there's, something squandered. And the fresh green breast of the new world then kind of changes, and you get the recollection. I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. So, in a sense, that kind of founding of America is parallel to Gatsby's own dreams. He sees this kind of light, but the reality of what is created from it is not exactly what he kind of desired in the first place. It's an anticlimactic end to it. And there's a sense that Nick, as our narrative voice, has this greater understanding than Gatsby had. He did not know that it was already behind him. So there's this sense of the kind of the failure, that this is gone, it's done with, and essentially it's over for Gatsby. And it kind of goes on. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. So this idea of the kind of better future, this kind of arousing future almost, in the kind of image, the orgastic future. But there's a sense of kind of futility here. Year by year it recedes before us, that we aren't kind of fulfilling this. There's a belief in it, but it's unfulfillable. And it kind of continues on to those last few lines, as he kind of breaks out of this. Tomorrow we'll run fast to stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, and then it breaks off. So this statement becomes a statement about society, that society and humanity will keep trying and one day break. Well, what happens? Will we succeed, or will there simply be the ultimate failure? Fitzgerald leaves an ambiguity at the end here. He suggests that it is the nature of humanity to, despite the kind of losses and the pains, to continue trying here to achieve something great. But there is this potential futility that's been built in alongside, and he kind of has it with the last image as well. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So that constant desire to move forward, but always that slipping backwards and slipping back into those kind of ideas of the past, and the past dragging people back, those older kind of ideals and traditions that we can't get rid of potentially. So he leaves the novel here, and in relation to kind of the American future in a kind of ambiguous state, he reminds us of the squandered potential of that new world, that it's been replaced with something kind of anticlimactic, but he doesn't suggest that's entirely the end of the journey, although there is still a futility that goes with it. It's kind of the last chance that we had, the last of that dreams that we had at the end here. Okay, so it becomes this kind of ambiguous comment on the nature of this kind of American system. So that'll do with it in terms of Gatsby today. Just as a kind of quick reiteration, the responses to Gatsby's funeral serve to kind of represent attitudes and values in that kind of changed American society. Gatsby's list here represents the kind of seeming way of success, but then the reminders of Gatsby's criminality throughout the chapter show us the reality of what is more likely to lead to success. And at the close of the novel here, Fitzgerald kind of broadens it out, and he makes this kind of comment on wider American society, and simply human society, and the kind of squandered potential, but that move forward and constant attempting to create something.